Hi, Roxanne. And also, if you would, you might want to open up chat if you haven't already done so, and participants, hit those two buttons. Barbara, thank you. I'm sorry for the interruption. Just wanted to get that information.
That's all right.
Okay.
We want to be sure to thank Mike, Ava, and Deirdre for continuing to help with the newsletter. Expect to receive the next issue of Michigas on April 1st. And if you're wondering who is reminding you about meetings, as well as summarizing them, please thank Ava Nachman. Our presentation today will be recorded, as Debbie said, and kept for 30 days. A link will be sent to all active members in a few days. Please open your chat window so that you can ask questions during the presentation, but keep your microphone muted. If you have a brick wall question, please stay after the meeting so that interested members can help you. And you can put those questions in the chat too at any time. Our speaker today is Emily Garber, who's going to talk to us about It's What They Answered To, Understanding Ashkenazic Jewish Names. She is a genealogy researcher, writer, and speaker, an anthropological archaeologist, say that fast 5 times, by training, and has been researching her family history since 2007. She's a highly qualified genealogist and very experienced, and we look forward to learning a lot from her. Emily?
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you so much for inviting me. Let me share my screen and get my PowerPoint started. Let's see. We got this one.
Emily, are you in Boston today?
I live in Phoenix, actually.
Ah, okay.
So you can see my one slide?
Yes.
Yeah.
Fantastic. We'll get going. You know, there are two, those of you who've researched for a while know that there are two very, very important questions that in Jewish genealogy that we really need to answer before we can even think about jumping the pond and going overseas to the places where our immigrant ancestors were originally from. And those are, the first one is, where did they come from? Basic question. And the second one was, what was their name? And that's the one we're going to concentrate on today. The reason why we need these things answered, this particular question answered, is because when we find names, we often find that they're more common than we think, that they, you know, if you have a relative or an ancestor named Jacob Cohn, you know that. But even some names that we might not think of as being particularly common, many times are. And part of that is that the naming patterns that we have, particularly in Ashkenazic among Ashkenazic Jews, which is really what I'm concentrating on today, what we see because of those naming patterns where people name after those who are gone, those who are deceased, you wind up with sometimes the same or very similar names repeated in families about every other generation. And sometimes, whoops, what just happened here? Oh, sorry, I have this issue. I am sorry, this has never happened before okay, this never happened before during a presentation. I apologize. Okay, you can see my slide again?
Yes.
Good, I'm sorry about that. Okay, naming patterns, many times what you can find even within the same generation, you'll find cousins may have the same exact name. So how would you, unless you know a lot about those people, it may be very difficult to distinguish between them. It's sometimes difficult to distinguish between them in American records. Imagine going back in another language with other records and trying to distinguish between cousins of the same name or among cousins of the same name. Whoops, now we're not working. Okay, that's no good. Whoop, here we go. Now, most Jewish immigrants, you'll find that many Jewish immigrants, their secular first names were changed after arrival because they wanted to sound more American, or they felt that their first names were difficult for Americans to pronounce. And I don't know if this is really an accurate figure, but we have heard through some studies that about 25 to 30% of the Jewish surnames from the Russian Empire in particular were changed after they immigrated to the United States. And of course, if they immigrated to other places, you may see some similar changes or even more in other locations. So we must really understand what those names were in the old country in order to find our people in records. So that's why we need to spend a lot of time here with our immigrant ancestors and try to figure out from the records in the United States or whatever country they ultimately went to try to figure out what their names might have been in the old country. And this is doable. One of the things we find with research in genealogy and the standard is that what we do is we research backwards in time. We go from what we know, which should be things that we know from records or from our experience, to the things that we are trying to find out. So you may start with death records and then move backwards to make sure at each stage that you are definitely researching your person, that you don't make a mistake in going to someone who may not actually be related to you. Let me give you an example here. So this is Rabbi Joshua Goldberg, his death certificate. He was born about 1860 and died in 1941 in Philadelphia. And he's buried in Delaware County, Pennsylvania, in Mount Lebanon Cemetery. Now, you'll notice on here that the informant for his death certificate was Morris Goldberg, who lived at 1715 North 8th Street in Philadelphia. Now, from this, we can't necessarily tell who this person was, but since he's got a similar last name, probably related, but maybe we can figure that out. But was Joshua Goldberg, was that his name when he came to the United States? Well, the first thing we do is we might look at his matzeva, his gravestone, and we find that his Hebrew name was Yehoshua, and he was the son of Avraham Tzvi. And then you don't always find last names written in Hebrew. It's always kind of fun when you do. But when we read this, we see that actually the name says Goldenberg. It doesn't say Goldberg. So that's interesting. It's either a mistake or maybe it's a clue. But until we find something else to confirm that, we're not quite sure. But we got to remember the Goldenberg there, because that could be important. I did find this guy, and we find that I did find him in a census. This is the 1930 census. Remember, he died in 41, but I just wanted to show you this one because he was living with Morris Goldberg, who is here, clearly his son. And this, you can't see the full address on this, but he was living at the same place that he identified on his father's death certificate, North 1715 8th Street. And here, Joshua is identified as Esha, Esha Goldberg. Interesting. I went through, I'm not going to show you all the different steps, but I did ultimately find this guy, Joshua, on his passenger manifest by systematically going back and also knowing something about Hebrew names and Yiddish names. So we know in the United States, he used the name Joshua, probably, and his Hebrew name was Yehoshua. On that census, it was shown as Esha. Now, we don't know if that is a function of someone not hearing the name right, or maybe that was a nickname for him. And we also see that on his passenger manifest, he was Ovsia or Ovshia, which we know, if one has looked at nicknames a little bit, that Ovshia is a Yiddish nickname for the Hebrew name Yehoshua. And we find on this that his name actually, when he came to the United States, was Ovshia Goldenberg, and they shortened that to Goldberg. So we were able to find out what his name, a variety of names that he might have used in the Old Country, but by following his records back systematically. So we've got his Joshua in English, Yehoshua in Hebrew, Esha, we're not quite sure about, and then Ovshia is definitely a Yiddish version of that. And you often find, interestingly enough, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but a lot of times in Yiddish, these nicknames, they kind of chop off the first syllable for some reason. For instance, the one that I think a lot of us see a lot is for the name Yisrael. A lot of times those people, their Yiddish name is Srul, starting with an S, which, throws people off a lot. But Srul is, if you say Yisrael, quickly you get Srul in there, and that winds up being their Yiddish name. So I kind of like this saying, it's not what they call you, it's what you answer to. And this is a saying that is possibly an old Nigerian saying, or if you look on the internet, it may very well be something that W.C. Fields has said. We don't know, but I really do think that it really talks about the Jewish people's kind of interesting relationship to names. There's a variety of different things that we might answer to, depending upon the circumstances. So what we're going to talk about today is as a big topic, and because of that, I really can't delve into it greatly in any particular area, but I will also try through your handout that you received and through what we talk about today and identifying some other sources of where you can look further. So this is just going to give you a taste of the kinds of things that you need to be looking at. So we'll talk about first names, both the religious ones, the ones that are in Hebrew, the ones in vernacular and secular names. We'll talk about surnames a little bit, how we got them, and when they changed, because there were a number of times when Jews might have changed their names, and the whole concept of Jewish surnames. And finally, we'll also talk about considerations for researching our immigrant ancestors in the Old Country. How do we get from here to there and make sure we're looking for the right names? So let's start with Ashkenazic first names. I like to break it up into kind of three different segments. The first is our religious names. And these are usually in Hebrew, or always in Hebrew, and they're pretty much for synagogue use. They'll be used if a child gets circumcised. They're used if you have a ketubah, which is in Aramaic, but they'll put the Hebrew names in there, and they'll identify the bride and groom with their Hebrew names. If somebody gets a divorce, those names will be placed on that document. And then, of course, the one that we see most often is Hebrew names on gravestones. So let's talk about the format of Hebrew names. Typically, they are patronymic, and that means that they include the father's name, which is just made for genealogy. We love this. So as an example, and this was actually my father's name, Dov Ben Yaakov, Dov, son of Yaakov. His father was Yaakov. A girl might be Rachel Bat or Bas Dov, as an example. Rachel, daughter of Dov. And you'll note, just because this is confusing to some people if you haven't studied Hebrew, that particular letter that the arrow is pointing to is pronounced differently in Ashkenazic Hebrew versus Sephardic Hebrew, which is what has been adopted in Israel. So when my father learned Hebrew years ago, he learned that letter was pronounced as an S. So you'll see Rachel Bas Dov. When I learned Hebrew, we were learning the Israeli style, since it was well after the founding of Israel, and people started teaching it as a T sound, as a T sound. And so it would be pronounced Rachel Bat Dov. So it's the same letter, it's the same thing, but for those of you who are confused by that, don't be. It just is a change in how the letters are pronounced. So in the Ashkenazic naming tradition, babies are typically named after a deceased relative. It is a tradition. It's not a law in Judaism by any stretch of the imagination, which probably gives you an idea of why it's sometimes quite variable. For example, traditionally, a boy would be named after a male relative and a girl will be named after a female relative who had passed away. In my case, that's not the situation. I was actually named after a great-grandfather. My parents apparently went to the rabbi and said, "You've got this name. What would be the female equivalent?" And I don't know how we figured that out, but they came up with a Hebrew name for me that way. I also found actually that a second cousin of mine was also a woman, was also named after this same great-grandfather. Her name wound up being Eileen in English, and my name wound up being Emily. And I hadn't known that until I talked to her. That's one thing I want to mention to you. It's something to keep in mind. When you first start your genealogy research, or even if you've been doing it for a while, it's always a good thing to ask your cousins or even your own relatives, if you don't know the answer, who were you named after? And who was that person? What is your Hebrew name? And who were you named after? What was the role of that person? What was the place of that person within the family? And it can be really interesting, and it may introduce you to new relatives that you need to start looking for further records on. Now, in Ashkenazic tradition, by the 12th century, this tradition seemed to have really taken hold. And it's at that point that you see names repeated about every other generation because people are starting to name after deceased relatives. Now, I'll give you a little kind of a quick summary of some of the kinds of things to look for in Hebrew naming traditions. When people are picking names, sometimes there are some names where people are named for particular events. So if a child perhaps was born around Purim, for example, if it was a girl, they might get the name Esther, a boy might get the name Mordecai, people who were characters who were important in the story. If someone was born, a boy was born around Passover, they might be called Pesach. If they were born near the Sabbath, they might be called Shabtai or Shepsel. And so those are possibilities. Of course, you always have to remember that if someone, let's say you had someone named Esther who was born around Purim, and then she passed away, her granddaughter might also be named Esther in honor of her, regardless of when the child was born during the ceremonial calendar year. So these things don't always follow, but it's something to look for. In the same way, there are some things we call amuletic names, perhaps names given for luck. Maybe a family had lost several children. And so when they had another son, they might have named him Alter, the older one, old, or Chaim and Chaya, which mean life. So, they might have been using it. Again, they might have just been naming after someone else, but maybe they chose this name because they felt it conferred some luck that this child would live. Then we've got the vernacular names. And in this case, the vernacular among Ashkenazic Jews is Yiddish. And pretty much these names were used every day by people. They were used by their family, by their friends, within their small community, and sometimes they were used in government records. So you need to know the Yiddish name to be able to find them. And you often see, in addition to the Hebrew name, particularly in the United States, you often see Yiddish names. Sometimes you see Yiddish names without Hebrew names, and I think that is principally because as Americans who don't really know either of those languages very well, if you are one of those people get confused. They don't know whether they're talking about a Yiddish name or a Hebrew name, and so they put one on there, and it may actually be a Yiddish name rather than Hebrew, but that's another story. So the format of Yiddish names is typically on a gravestone, for example. You'll see, if you did it properly, it would be a Hebrew name, a Yiddish name, followed by son of or daughter of, and then the father's Hebrew name. Sometimes they also will include a Yiddish name. So my father, whose American name was Bernard, okay, when he was born in the United States. But his Hebrew name was Dov. The Yiddish equivalent for that was Ber. So they gave him the name Dov Ber, and he was Ben Yaakov. And I don't know if my great-grandfather had a second name, but I know that in Yiddish he was called Yankel. But on the gravestone, it just says Yaakov. If a daughter was named Rachel, she could have pretty much, she might have any name. In this case, these two names, Fega and Rachel, don't go along together, but Fega is a Yiddish name. And so someone could be Rachel. She might have been called Fega in the family, and she would have been the daughter, in this case, as an example, of Avraham Abba. So this is how you often see it on a stone, that you get the Hebrew name first, Yiddish name, and then the patronymic. Now, there are a number of different ways that people get their Yiddish names. And sometimes there actually is a relationship between the Yiddish names and the Hebrew names. And I showed you one of those with Dov Ber. In that case, you see that Dov and Ber in their respective languages, Hebrew and Yiddish, both have the same meaning. They both mean the animal bear. And that's called a calque. That is words of the same meaning, but from different languages. So Arya in Hebrew means lion, as does Leib in Yiddish, or Leib in Yiddish. Ze'ev means wolf, as does wolf. Dov, bear, Tzvi, and Hirsch, you see these combinations frequently. They both mean deer. Zipporah for a woman, Fega, both mean bird. And Asher and Zelig are also names that often appear together. They mean happy or joyful. This is just a few examples. There are more. So you might get then someone Dov Ber Ben Tzvi Hirsch. Those would be two calques, okay? Dov Ber and Tzvi Hirsch. Now, but you also, to make it confusing, you also get some double names that maybe have no association. Perhaps someone's named Mordechai Leib. Maybe they're named after two different relatives. Those particular names that we don't really have a particular link in meaning or anything like that, they're not calques, but perhaps because of the family history, they wanted to use both of those names. But then there are other ones that are biblical associations, and I'll show you some of those. So these typically are blessings. They come from Genesis chapters 48 and 49, where Jacob, you remember that scene where Jacob blessed his sons and his grandsons. Well, what he did was he compared them to different animals in a good way. So Naphtali, for example, was compared to a deer. Well, the Yiddish term for deer, we talked earlier, is Hirsch. So in this case, even though Naphtali and Hirsch don't mean the same thing, they have as an association because Naphtali was compared to a deer. So those names sometimes you'll find that someone whose name in Hebrew was Naphtali may have been called Hirsch in Yiddish. Same thing with Benjamin Wolf. So you'll see these names frequently go together, and this is why. Ephraim and Fischel, Yehuda and Leib. So before we talked about Arya and Leib as calques, because both of those names mean lion. Yehuda itself doesn't mean lion, but he was blessed by Jacob and said he was like a lion. So that's why you sometimes get these together. So you don't know necessarily when you're looking at these names at the outset why you see them together, but this can give you some ideas. And then we have nicknames, and nicknames. I think about this sometimes like a Russian novel. You know, if you've ever read some Russian novels, you might get someone starting out with a particular name, and later on, there's another name, and you go, what? And you're trying to keep track of these things, and the challenge is not understanding what the nicknames are. So in Yiddish, I've seen people named Alexander Jewish men named Alexander, and in Yiddish, they're called sender. And you have to know that. Otherwise, you'd think, well, I'm dealing with two different people. Well, sometimes it's pretty clear. So someone whose Hebrew name is Avraham, they might be called Avram. Yitzhak, Itzko, or Itzik. Mordechai, Mordko, or Motel, and that changes depending upon where in the old country you're looking. Yaakov, Yankel, Yehoshua, we've showed you Oshia, Moshe, Moshko, or Moishe. Yisrael, I talked about Srul. Ber, sometimes you see him as Berish or Burko. These are all names in Yiddish that are kind of nicknames. Then I talked about how, a lot of times what you do is they kind of lopped off the first syllable. So you'll find a lot of men in Yiddish, their name is Laser. Well, that means likely that their Hebrew name was Eliezer. Ephraim becomes Froyim. A lot of those people became Frank when they changed their name in the United States. You might say, well, how did they get from Ephraim to Frank? And it's because probably in Yiddish, they were called Froyim. And then Emmanuel, Mane or Manish. And this one to me is rather confusing because I have relatives where it shows that my great-great-grandfather's first name was Mane, and I am not sure. Mane is also a Yiddish name, but it can also be a nickname for Emmanuel. So I'm not sure whether he was named after someone named Emmanuel or whether he was named after someone named Mane. So it can get confusing. And someday maybe I'll figure that out. That will probably break through a brick wall in my family. It is a little crazy. It can make you nuts, but this stuff is doable. And you really, if you work at it and you become familiarize yourself with this stuff, and we'll talk a little bit about that, you can figure it out. But it can be a real mass of confusion for a lot of us. One of the things that's really nice about this, though, is particularly with Ashkenazic people, is we can figure out some genealogical answers to some of our questions. So for example, this is I was wondering about my great-grandmother, Hannah Mazavitsky Garber. And I know that she died sometime before November 1922, which is when her husband, her widower husband, emigrated to the United States. So but one of the problems I have is there are no records known from the little town that they were from in the Russian Empire. And I've been there and I looked through the cemetery. Most of the stones are fallen down or buried, just as happens when things are not kept up. And I never found a tombstone for her, a gravestone for her. So I don't know when she died, but I can get an idea by looking at the children who were named after her. And so I looked at all the children, her children, and there were actually a couple of more, but the ones that had daughters. When did they start naming daughters after Hannah? And what I found is that the last child, let's get this going here. Okay. The last child who was not named after her was my grandfather. This is my grandfather, Jack, or Yankel. His daughter, his first child, was born in 1917, and she was not named for Hannah. You would have thought, likely if her parents were gone, if her father's mother was gone, that she might have been named after her father's mother, but she wasn't. She was named Leah. The next child that was named, the next girl child that was born that was named was in 1921, and that was Annette. And then 1926, we have a Hannah. And then in 1928, we have Anita. And in 1938, we have Annette. We have a lot of Annettes and Anitas in my family because they're all named after Hannah. And so when I look at this, I can see that probably Hannah died sometime between September 1917 and May 1921. Now, it would be better to get it a little bit closer, but that's the best I can do right now and feel fairly confident that, okay, that's probably when she passed away. I want to then go to the Ashkenazic given names, the secular ones. And typically secular names are used are often in the language of the greater country that people lived in. So it wouldn't have been in Hebrew or in Yiddish, but more likely in whatever language was used by the surrounding community in which the Jews were interacting. So it's often used in government records, and most recently used on gravestones as well as the Hebrew names. So when you go back into the old country, the older graves likely won't have stuff written in Russian or German if you're in the Austrian Empire, but they likely will have things written in Hebrew. And you do see that even in more traditional style gravestones in the United States, although typically you see more often that there is English and Hebrew. So we do get the name in English frequently. These are the names that were most likely to change when people immigrated. They were the ones that they probably didn't use all that much. They probably weren't used by the family all that much. And they were the ones that were therefore easiest to change. Essentially, the name that we use outward looking, that people would call us from outside, those people who are outside our local community. So let me give you just a quick example here. Here, this is Harris Goldberg. On the left, you see his gravestone, very, very complex, from Leeds. And this one actually is in Jober, the Jewish online worldwide burial registry that you can find on Jewish Gen. And his name in Hebrew was Tzvi ben Moshe. So his father was Moshe and his first name was Tzvi. We talked a little bit earlier about how the Hebrew name Tzvi often goes along, not always, but often goes along with the Yiddish name Hirsch. And so we can see, even if we didn't know that, or if we didn't see his son's matseva, which I've got on the side here and I'll talk about in a moment, we can see, well, okay, he might have been called Hirsch, and maybe that's why he adopted the name Harris when he moved to England. And here we've got a couple of his sons. We've got Julius Goldberg, who actually is buried in Nebraska, and he was Yehuda Leib ben Tzvi. So that fits nicely with his father's matseva, which says his father's name was Tzvi. And then we've got another son, Isaac Goldberg, who was buried in England. I don't remember exactly where, I think in a cemetery in London. And he was Yitzchak Eliakim Getzel. I don't know why he's got three names. Ben Tzvi Hirsch. So this one really does include the Yiddish name. They're all Tzvi and Tzvi Hirsch are referring to the same person, Harris Goldberg. So one thing to recognize, particularly when you're going into old world records, is that we've got the Hebrew alphabet and we've got our Americanized alphabet. And then we've also got a Russian alphabet if you're dealing in Russian gravestones. So in Hebrew and the Yiddish alphabet, there is the letter H, which is represented by a hey. And so you can see how the name Hirsch would be spelled, okay? And then for the name like Garber, we've got a G sound, both in English and in Yiddish and in Hebrew. And so, that is represented by the letter Gimel. Sometimes you'll see a name like Alperin or Galperin, and you'll see that it's got an Aleph in the beginning, or it might have a Gimel before that, Galperin. Just for fun, I put in, this was a gravestone that on the right here rather, that I found in my, in the cemetery, Jewish cemetery in my little town in Ukraine. And here is Garber written in Cyrillic.
Oh.
Now, this is actually for a woman, and I don't know how this person is or might be related to me, because she might have been married to somebody, and I just don't know. But let's go through this a little bit more in Russian. Now, the challenge is when you try to look up these names in the Russian alphabet is in the Russian alphabet, there actually is no letter representing the H sound. There is a letter that is transliterated either as G or H, and it's this letter here. Oops, this one right here. And so the name Hirsch is often rendered by this like this, and it is transliterated either as Gersh or Hirsch. Same name. You'll see, as I showed you on that matseva, that Garber in Cyrillic would be written this way, Garber. And that would be, sometimes it would be translated, could be transliterated as Harbor or Garber, but oftentimes they just drop the first letter and transliterate it as Arbor. And I actually have found a voters list that lists my great-grandfather, Avraham Abba, as Arbor rather than Garber. So when I go back to look at Russian records, I need to be aware of that and be looking not just under the G sound, but also under the A sound, because that's where they might be listed as well, depending upon how the name was written in Russian. And for that, the reason why I threw out the name Alpern above is because be aware, if you have a name like Halpern or Galperin or Alperin or Halperin, that it might be spelled like that, or it might be spelled without that first letter. And it's all the same name, essentially. So you need to understand these variables. So getting back to Harris Goldberg, I won't go through this because it was kind of complex and crazy, but I ultimately found out that their name wasn't Goldberg, that the name was actually in the old country in Yakovichi, which is in Belarus today. Their name was, get this, Voloch-Viansky. No wonder they changed it, but why they selected Goldberg is anybody's guess. But when I was looking through Jewish Gen's index of revision lists from 1874, I found those three people, the father Harris, Yehuda, Julius, and Isaac, Yitzhak or Itzko, in the 1874 Yakovichi revision list, and with their Yiddish names. So we see Harris is listed as not Hirsch, but Gersh. And remember, his father's name was Moshe. His father is listed as Movsha, the Yiddish version of Moshe in this area. Then we've got Itzko, son of Gersh, Yudel, instead of Yehuda, which is a Yiddish version of a Yiddish nickname for Yehuda. So you need to know these variations sometimes in order to find these people. I did say at the outset that, there's a lot to learn even just on first names. So I want you to know that there is a wonderful resource online on Jewish Gen among their info files, which I just love their info files, lots of information. Warren Blatt did a very lengthy PowerPoint presentation, and all of his slides from that PowerPoint are under an info file called Jewish Given Names. Now, he does occasionally still give this talk, and if you do see him giving it someplace about Jewish given names, I highly recommend that you look at it. It can get into this much more than I can today. I'm just giving you a little taste, but he will really kind of make your head spin on some of this stuff. I will say, for me, what has really helped is doing a lot of transcription and translation of gravestones for the Jewish Gen online worldwide burial registry. I have gone through thousands of gravestones. And when I started, my Hebrew, which came from way back when before I was bat mitzvahed, was pretty rusty. But just doing it brought a lot of that back, and doing it made me learn a lot of Hebrew and Yiddish names that I didn't know starting out. So I highly recommend doing something like that. It can really help your skills. And it helps the genealogy community, because if we can get photographs of gravestones put online, that's a wonderful thing and can help us move beyond the American records and help us get back to the old country. So I'm going to take a sip of water and we'll get onto surname adoptions. Okay. So, the first thing we got to think about, we're kind of used to everybody having surnames, but when you think about it, why do we have surnames at all? Well, for most of time, people didn't have surnames. They started to adopt them when it became advantageous for people to have them. Typically, that was when people were moving beyond their small town life. In a small town, you could go by the name Emily, and maybe I'd be the only one in town, and people would know who I was. Or they'd say, "Oh, Emily's daughter of Bernard," and they'd all know who I was, as opposed to Emily, daughter of Shmuel. Okay, so if you're just staying within your small community, it's not a problem. If you're a merchant going to larger communities, you might adopt surnames, some sort of surname, but not one that you would keep necessarily. Maybe that was just a name that you used in the larger communities so people could differentiate you from others. So business travel from town to town, sometimes then people would adopt names that they would keep. But not necessarily, it varied of whether they were returning to their small town, maybe they didn't use it there at all. The other time when people adopted surnames, and this is really the most important aspect of dealing with Jewish people, Ashkenazi people, particularly in Central Europe as well as in Eastern Europe, is when the government needed to keep track of people. They said, well, in order to tax people and in order to conscript young men, we need to know who they are and we need to be able to track them. And if all we have is a first name and a patronymic, that makes it harder. We need people to adopt surnames and keep them for life and pass them on to their children so we know who's related to whom. And so that's pretty much what started happening with Jewish people. Some people adopted surnames earlier, but when the government said, no, everybody needs to have a surname, that's when things really started to change. Now, throughout history, there's, most people, as I said, didn't use surnames. No one used surnames. They had used just first names. The first people that we see worldwide to adopt surnames were the Chinese, way back a long time ago. In Germany, and this is pretty much true with most people, in worldwide, surnames typically evolved organically for most people. Usually it was the nobility and the gentry first, so the aristocracy, who adopted surnames. Among Jewish people, it was often the rabbis who adopted surnames first, or merchant families that were well-to-do. But we see, in Germany, we get aristocracy before 1000, German craftsmen and tradesmen, as they get better and better at their trades, they want to be well-known and they want to pass on their yichus, if you will, and they adopted surnames. Polish nobles did it before Polish peasants, and Jews wind up being kind of in that little area there. And you'll notice actually in Iceland, they're still kind of haven't quite adopted them yet. I was hearing something that was reading a while back that in Iceland, because so many people, they don't have these surnames, they're still using patronymics. The people need to have an app to be able to tell whether they're related to someone that they're dating. It's something to worry about. Among Jews, and I put a little fist there saying we were forced to adopt surnames by the government, pretty much. There were people, like I said, some merchants and rabbinical families who may have adopted surnames earlier, surnames that they were allowed to keep, when the laws changed. But for the most part, most Jews did not adopt surnames until they were forced to. The earliest hereditary surnames among Jews were among the Sephardim in North Africa, Spain, Italy, and France. By the 10th, 12th century, you see some prominent families. As I said, they always seem to be the ones adopting first. By the 14th century, you see some hereditary names starting to be adopted. And then, of course, when the Inquisition hit, converts had to change their names to, if they wanted to live, and they converted or leave, they adopted their Christian godfathers' names. So you see a lot of changing names in the Spanish areas after the Inquisition. Among Ashkenazic, about the 17th century and earlier, you start seeing rabbinical families adopting names, although many rabbis were not commonly known by their surnames. Many times they were known by the community in which they lived. So, it might be the rabbi of Prague or something like that, Shmuel, the rabbi of Prague or something like that. By the first country that said to everybody, the first country in Europe that said to everybody, you Jews, you must adopt surnames, was in Austria. The Emperor Joseph II required Jews to adopt German language names by 1787. Just to give you an example, this actually, jumping back to Germany, Napoleon actually required Jews in the German areas that he conquered or took over to adopt surnames. And this is one that was done just prior to that. I think it was 1806 in the Würzburg area. In 1803, this is a tabular register of Jews in Würzburg. And you'll see this is a community called Nordheim-Vorderrhön. And there is Lesser Hirsch, and Lesser was, let's see, he was 68 years old. And then there's an Israel Lesser. In German records, you often see that the second name listed is the patronymic. So Israel, likely the son of this Lesser. So Lesser was the son of Hirsch. Israel was the son of Lesser, and then another son, Menke, the son of Lesser. And you could see, okay, Israel was 36 in 1903, and Menke was 25. When we start looking at this, and this was put together, a researcher named Dirk Rosenstock, put together a book identifying the names that were taken when Napoleon required surnames in these German areas. But we can look at this and we can see for ourselves that it makes sense that, okay, so Lesser was old enough certainly to be the father of Israel and Menke. The son's age are consistent with later vital records that show that they took the name Baum, B-A-U-M. Or Baum, if you want to pronounce it in a German fashion. The ones in the United States pronounce it Baum. Now, Lesser, there was an actual enumeration in 1817, and Lesser was not in the enumeration. He had died by then. His wife, Chaya, or Hannah, who died in 1819, she was in the 1817 enumeration, and she was recorded as Lesser Hirsch's widow. And later on, we do see that both Israel and Menke had sons that they named Hirsch. So we can use the traditions, the Ashkenazic traditions of naming after someone who had passed away. In this case, their likely grandfather, Hirsch, for some of their children. So just to give you an example of how we can track from records that don't have surnames to records that do. Now, in the Austrian Empire, I mentioned by 1787, people had to take surnames, but there was a deadline that they had to do this. The edict was in July, and by January the following year, they had to adopt new surnames. Now, this was locally implemented, community by community. Those who already had surnames, providing they met the standard of German kind of name, German sounding name, they could keep those names. So there are some people who already had names and didn't have to change them. There was actually they even had to change their first names if they weren't German names. And they actually gave the Jews a list of 120 male names and 37 female names, but then they broadened the list later on. So they weren't limited to just those names. Jews were prohibited from using place names or names that were based in Jewish languages. So you couldn't use a word from Yiddish, for example, that was not also a word in German. And they couldn't use common German names. So I don't know, I don't have a list actually of what those were, but they had to be careful. They were trying to differentiate the Jews. Get the Jews to become more German, more Austrian, but they also wanted to make sure they knew who they were. Each family in a locality received a different surname. So how you define a family is an interesting question, or how they defined it in each locality. But certainly you could have, if they defined it as a household, then you could certainly have different households who might have been related wind up with different surnames. And you certainly could have people from different localities wind up with the same surname, even though they were not related at all. So now we know why we're so confused. Now, there were actually records kept of this process, and the records were taken. Remember, there were no Xerox machines at that time. So they took the record and they sent it to who was ever keeping the information for the next census. The records included what name was selected, what their nicknames were, what their occupations were, where they lived, and who their family members were, because they wanted all these people to maintain the same name. And guess what? None of these records had ever been found. I know that for the most part, Austrian census records were destroyed after the information from them was taken. And apparently these records were done away with as well. Very sad story. Now, the Russian Empire did it a little differently. For those of you who know about the Russian takeover of some portions of Eastern Europe, that happened at the same time as Prussia and Austria was taking over between about 1770s and 1795. By 1795, the partition of what had been the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was complete, and there was no longer any Poland. And so Russia, which had some laws previously that said we don't allow Jews within the empire, all of a sudden wound up with a huge population of Jews in the areas that we now know as Poland, portions of Poland, Belarus, Lithuania, Ukraine. So they needed to do something about these people. What they said was that as in 1804, they passed their first edict that said, during the census, every Jew shall have or accept a known inherited family name or surname or nickname that shall be used in all documents and lists without any change. So they had to identify a name, and they had to keep it. Early on, between 1804 and 1844, so the first 40 years, it was the Kahal, the local Jewish community structure within each community, that controlled the implementation of the naming and the adoption of names. Spelling was supposed to be consistent and could not be altered. But remember, we're dealing with several different alphabets. You're dealing with Cyrillic, and in this case, Cyrillic and Hebrew or Yiddish. And so how do you know spelling is consistent? And which is it? So supposedly it had to be consistent in Cyrillic, but keeping that up with clerks who were recording documents is a whole nother, and rabbis who were recording documents, it's a whole nother thing. There have not been any Kahal generated lists of names that have been found. So we just don't have that, unfortunately. And there are no contemporary descriptions of the surname adoption process in the Russian Empire. Now, there have been some studies, and there's a remarkable, wonderful study by Jeffrey Mark Paul and Jeffrey Briskman and this is in your handout, so you don't need to quickly copy this down. But what they did was they looked at the town of Slutsk in Belarus, a census that was taken in 1774. Remember, this would have been before Jews were required to have names, and they didn't have, rather surnames, and they didn't have fixed surnames in this area at that time. They looked at several households, and in one case, just as an example, they had the head of the household was Itzka Ivansky, and apparently Ivansky in this case was a nickname. And he had two sons living in his household, Shmoila Itzkovitz. In this case, that means Itzkovitz means son of Itzka, and Leba, son of Itzka. And next door, in the next household, there was Hirsch or Gersh, son of Itzka. So probably related. Living next door, likely another son in a separate household. So they looked at this, and this was, as I said, 1774. So the 1804 rules went in. They needed to take surnames. So what surnames did they get? So they looked then at the next Russian revision list or census, which was 1811. And in 1811 in Slutsk, they found 3 households. There was Shmoila, son of Itzka, who he actually had died in 1803, but his family had taken the name Brodsky, okay? There was Hirsch, he actually died in 1796, so his family had not taken a name. And there was Leba, whose family took the name Kraskov. So what we're seeing is that these people wound up probably by the time of the census, by the time they were required to take names, they were probably in different households, and they wound up with different surnames, even though they were brothers. So I want to talk a little bit, and we'll come back to some of the implications of all this kind of stuff, but I want to jump into some of the surname changes we see in Eastern Europe. Typically, we tend to think about surname changes as something that happened once people immigrated, but the more you study people in the old country, the more you realize, well, there was name changing going on back then as well. And certainly we've seen name changes that were implemented due to edict by government. So what we see is, of course, in the Austrian Empire, we had those edicts back in the late 1700s, 1787, I believe, and they said, well, you need to take a name. Well, but, Jews were recalcitrant, I guess. And so by 1826, there was a new edict, and it said, not only did you need to take a name, but you're not allowed to change your name. If the name is going to be changed, it needs to be approved by the emperor himself. The only exceptions would be if you're converting to Christianity or joining the nobility. And in both, probably more or less the same thing. And then spelling, they wanted spelling to be stabilized, but it continued to be variable. So when you're looking at these old world records, be aware that spelling, just like it is in the United States, early on is variable and doesn't count. It's how something sounds. But really in the Austrian Empire, what we see that greatly affects the surnames is marriage laws. In 1726, many, many years earlier, Charles VI created what were called the Familianten regulations. And these had a lot of aspects to them in terms of controlling the population. But they said for Jewish people that only one son of a Jewish family could have a legitimate household. They were trying to limit the Jewish population in a kind of hammer fashion. They said, so I don't care how many children you have, only one son of your family can have a legitimate family. And for this privilege, they will be registered and they'll pay a large tax. There will be strict quotas on the number of Jewish families in each community. And if you know anything about German families as well, or families in Poland, in these nobility, noble-owned communities. It was very similar. Generally, for a Jew to enter a community and live there and do business, they had to have an agreement with the nobleman. And there might have been strict quotas on, you know, how many butchers can be, Jewish butchers can be in that community. So if a family was a family of butchers and there was a son who wanted to join his father in the business, he might not be able to do so because he might be told, no, I'm sorry, we have enough Jewish butchers, you need to go someplace else. That happened a lot in Germany. And that's why a lot of times you see a lot of German immigration about mid-century in the 19th century. Now, by 1867, so 140 years later, the Jews were emancipated in the Austrian Empire, and the country abolished the Familientan regulations. But old ideas die hard, and many Jews continued to marry religiously, but not civilly, because what had happened with Jews didn't stop marrying or stop having families, even though these Familientan regulations were in effect. They would still go to a rabbi and get married, and they'd have a family, but the family was not recognized civilly. They didn't register their marriage civilly and pay the fee, and the family members then were not recognized as being legitimate. So what were the sanctions against non-civil marriage? Children, as I said, were identified as illegitimate, and people get confused sometimes when they start looking at some of the records that you'll see on like JRI Poland for various Austrian records, Austrian Empire records. You'll see the children frequently are identified as illegitimate. Well, that was pretty much the norm because many couples did not register their marriage civilly, even though they might have been married by a rabbi. The official sanction, there were official transactions, official transactions that these children did, they had to do in the surname of their mother, because legally there was no recognition of who their father was. So if they wanted to apply for a business license, buy property, or own land, they had to do it in the name of their mother. If they did get married and registered their marriage civilly, they would be identified under their mother's maiden name. If they wanted travel documents, the travel documents might reflect that they were illegitimate. And so, you know, a lot of times you do see that, and I'll mention in the next couple of slides, that there were ways of curing the situation. And you'll see a lot of times that couples who are quite old, who obviously already had their children many years before, suddenly get married, you know, when they're like in their 50s or 40s. There's a lot of different reasons why that might have happened. One is that they might have their children wanted to immigrate, and they wanted to have their father's name legitimized. And the other thing was inheritance, that if a child did not have was not considered legitimate, they could not inherit their father's property. So if there was property to inherit, you might see the parents later in life just going through the process of getting their marriage civilly registered, so that their children the clerk could go back into their children's birth records and correct the record, a way of curing it, so that they could use their father's name. So there was this way of curing. Let me show you a couple of these records. And I'm sorry we're going a little bit long, but we'll get there pretty soon here. And I'll just kind of zip through this because we are going a little long.
Emily, don't rush. Don't rush.
Okay, then.
We're good.
I hope this is okay with people. This is an 1893 birth registration for the town of Mielnica in Galicia. And the child is Laser, and he is identified as illegitimate right there. And there's no, and you'll see this is the place where a father would be named. There's no father named. Now, the mother was Basia Liederman, the daughter of Manas and Zlate from the town of Usia Biskupi. I love that name. But again, there's no father identified. And and because of this, he was considered to be, Laser was considered to be illegitimate. Now, children, again, in this case, we find the child registered under the mother's surname if they registered them at all. So Laser would have been known as Laser Liederman if he was registered under his mother. He would be under his mother's name. In this case, there's no father's name listed at all. Now, if the father appeared with two witnesses to attest that he was indeed the father, then they might relent. And then in this location, they'd probably have a note here showing who the father was, and then another note here naming the father and his origins. Let me show you the next one down. We had Laser. This is the next one down on the register list from February 2nd, 1893. This is Mariam, and she too is identified as illegitimate. But in this case, we do see that her father is identified as Srul Hafner, Hafner being his last name. He was also from Mielnitsa. His mother was Perl Venkert. This actually is a relative of mine. She was the daughter of Joseph Schmiel and Fega, and these people were from the town of Zelistchiki. What you also see is a lot of notations here. And what they're talking about there is that this couple, Perl and Joseph Schmiel, wound up getting married later in life, and it was recorded. And then they went back and they identified the page numbers on which that marriage was recorded. And they put this on the birth record of Mariam, so she could be essentially legitimized. And you'll see here it says paid. So their marriage is in their marriage register for that town, from Mielnitsa, on page 165 and 66 in whatever year it was. And then you can actually, well, in this case, I'm showing you that if they married later, civilly, parents of the adult child could petition for the birth records to be amended. And so they were able to show both parents. Let me then, so just for fun, I said, well, okay, we've got the page numbers. Let's find the marriage record. And here it is. So I went back and I looked for the marriage record, and we see here's Srul Hafner. It gives what town he was from, who his parents were, how old he was. You see, he was 46 years old, and his wife, Rezi Perl Venkert, was 44. So clearly they had these children earlier, but then later came back a few years later and married and then legitimized their daughter or whatever other children you had. And I had mentioned that it was pages 165 and 166, and you can see what I circled here. These are those pages of that. And we can also see the marriage date. It was 1897, and those earlier birth records were 1893. So several years later, they got married and essentially legitimized, cured the record, legitimizing their children. I want to point out a couple of several different things that you need to be looking out for if you're looking at Old World Record. You might see the word with a name that says false or just an F period. And what that means is incorrectly. So if you had a name associated with that Mariam's birth record, Mariam Venkert, false Hafner, what that would mean is there was Mariam Venkert, and she was falsely called Hafner. So she was using her father's name, but she really wasn't supposed to, because she was illegitimate. So Hafner would have been her mother's name in this case. If you see the word recta, it means legally, or the R, it means legally or correctly. And so you might have Mariam if Mariam was called Mariam Hafner, it might say, well, Hafner, she really shouldn't be using the name Hafner because that wasn't the right name. She really should be called, legally or correctly, should be called by the last name Venkert. So Rekte Venkert. And another one that you'll see is Vel, and that's sometimes shown as V period. And that means alias or otherwise called. It's usually, not always, but usually used with first names. In this case, we see, and this is for a record for my great uncle, Sigmund Libros. He was born, this is a birth record. He was born in Rodaut, Bukovina. And his birth record shows him as Selig Vel Sigmund. So what that's showing is Selig was his Yiddish name. Sigmund was his approved German name in German-speaking Austria. So they say, okay, yeah, we can call him Sigmund, but otherwise called, or alias, Selig and Sigmund. And you see this a lot of times. So here's my family, and it includes that same guy, Selig Sigmund, who later took the name Sydney in the United States. This was their Liverpool departure manifest, which had their names in Hebrew, in the German. So we have my great-grandmother, who became Bertha in the United States. She was Breine or Breindl. My grandmother, who became Tilly. Her Hebrew name was Tova, but she's Tovi on this. And then we've got her sisters, Rose, Reisel, Max, Mane. Sydney, we talked about as Selig or Sigmund. Harry, he was Herman on the manifest, but his actual Hebrew name was Yisrael, and his Yiddish name was Hirsch. We had Janos, who was Joseph Jerome in the United States, and then Cyril, who became Seal in the United States. So you can see how these names are changing. Here's Sidney again, and this is his gravestone. And he was called Sidney Libros. His Hebrew name, we knew that his Yiddish name was Selig, and that was used on his birth record. We didn't know from those previous records that his Hebrew name was Asher. So his name was actually Asher Selig ben Eliezer. So we could see that when we put it all together. And we could see the various names that he's used at various stages in life. But are there Jewish surnames? This is a question we get a lot. Particularly now that we see more and more people doing DNA testing, and they see, oh, I've got some Jewish background. I wonder which name was the Jewish one. Well, are there Jewish surnames? There are two answers, and I apologize. I just put a cough drop in my mouth so I don't cough. One answer to that question is no. The concept of a surname that we've learned today is not a Jewish construct. In a religious context, you had a patronymic, the Hebrew first name followed by the father's Hebrew first name. No last names. Most Jews have surnames from the old country as a result of government edicts. And most of those surnames are derived from languages spoken in the local areas where those people were living. There are many names that are shared by both Jewish and Christian families. So a name like Schwartz, we tend to think, oh, that's a Jewish name. Not necessarily. So don't go by that. You really can't. Now, a lot of people say, oh, well, that name sounds like a Jewish name. It's because it kind of sounds German-like. Yiddish has many commonalities with Middle High German. Most Yiddish surnames are similar to German surnames. And in certain areas of Eastern Europe, Jews adopted German surnames due to what was required by the Austrian government, and they kept those surnames later. Now, we said there are two answers. One answer to the question of are there Jewish surnames is no, and then there's also a yes. There are a very few that are derived from Hebrew or Aramaic and are probably particular to Jewish people. And just as an example, some of the jobs that we have that nobody else has, like Melamed, Ashkenazi, Cohen, Levi, Chazan or Chazin. I used to have a friend when I was in school named Chazin. So these names are possibly originally Jewish names. Of course, you could have people with these names who are no longer Jewish. Perhaps one of their ancestors changed to another religion, converted, or maybe they did. So you can't always tell by a name, but this could give you a little bit of an idea of what their background might have been. Let's go now to name changes after immigration. Excuse me. Now we can see, based upon the history of surnames, that Jews really didn't have a lot of investment in their surnames. Many times they didn't get them until, middle part of the 19th century. And maybe they were leaving a generation or leaving from that place a generation or two after. So it really wasn't a big deal. It wasn't a family tradition. And we also see, because of differences in alphabets, there are differences in spellings that did happen, of course. A typical Russian name that became Bernstein would have been Bodenstein. So it's basically the same name, but pronounced and written in a different language. There were names that were simplified. So I had some Rappaports in my family. Some of them became Rapp. I have Wilsons in my family. When I started doing my research, I figured out that their original name was Wilensky, but I also have met Wilenskys who changed their name to Willens. Okay, Londa sometimes became London, didn't necessarily, but could have. Aronovich maybe became Aaron. People shortened it or simplified it. And then you see cases where the names were completely changed. So one of my favorites was the name Flickoff, and some of those people changed their name to Fleck. I've found Kesselmans who changed their name to Kasti, Uchenik. Sometimes, those first ones, Flickoff and Fleck and Kesselman and Kasti, at least it was the same sound. But then you've got some where they just kind of wholesale changed the name. I have Ucheniks, who I found out changed their name to Robinson, Maturin to Eisenberg. I mentioned Volokh-Viansky earlier, who changed their name to Goldberg. And I've got Chertok, who changed their name to Wagner. There are no laws, no rules. I'll give you a quick case study. And this is a real quickie, but it was a simple one. I was approached by a client whose last name was Wagner, and they were trying to figure their grandfather's name was Jackson Wagner, and they couldn't figure out what the original family surname was. And my first reaction was, well, it could have been Wagner, because I didn't know where they were from at the time. I said if they were from Austria, certainly Wagner is a good German name. But it turns out that wasn't the case. I looked at Jackson Wagner and just couldn't find anything. I looked at his brother, who actually is on this census record here, Samuel, a younger brother. Couldn't find anything in his records either. Then I went to the oldest brother in the family, and his name was Irving Wagner. And this is the 1925 US Census, which is one of my favorite census records because it has a spot shown in yellow here where they tell you whether or not the person was naturalized, and if so, when and in what court. So this one says SC New York 1922. That means they were naturalized in the Supreme Court of New York County in 1922. Now, sometimes, they get the year not quite right, but in this case, it wound up being a good thing. So I was looking for the naturalization record for Irving Wagner to try to figure out if I could find his passenger manifest and figure out what his original name might have been. Well, I found it, and it was easier than I thought because this was done late enough. He actually was naturalized in 1924. You see, 1922 was on the census record. Oh, well. But we see that his name is listed. This certificate of arrival was created by people at Ellis Island going into the old manifests and confirming Irving's arrival in the country. And he arrived as Itzko Chertok. Okay. So then I could go to the passenger record, which unfortunately had lots of tape all over it. You can see this spot here, very difficult to read, couldn't quite make it out. And I'll make it bigger so you can see it. You can see I've got the name Chertok, but I don't have a first name. And there appeared to, the first Chertok was 12 years old, then there was a 9-year-old. But it did say that they were going to Sore Chertok, and I didn't know that their mother's name was Sarah. Sore is Yiddish version of Sarah. And the address fit with Sarah's brother, who at 8 Market Street in Manhattan. So that was good. But there was also a record of special inquiry, and on New York records, that means in the passenger manifests that have been digitized, we can go to the end of the manifest and find another version, perhaps typed, and in this case, yes, indeed. And I could see from that, even though I couldn't read it on the first page, that indeed this Chertok was Itzko Chertok. It still didn't say what his brother's name was. It just said brother. So I didn't know. I thought this might be Jackson, my client's father, but I wasn't sure. But I want to, even though that was pretty good, so I know the name was Chertok. We don't know how it was spelled in Russian. It could have been Tsertok or Chertok, so it could have been spelled like that or like that with different first letters. We don't know. But I was able to go to the gravestone of when Max passed away, and I was able to confirm that he was Yitzhak, and that at least we know what his first name was, and that the father was this is all the right people. But I didn't stop there, and I'm not going to continue on, with this because it's a long case study. But the bottom line is, I use this as an example. But I want you to know that there was further research, because I said, yeah, okay, I've got one record, but I need to get other records to confirm that this is not, this is the way things were. So I was able to find an aunt of these people where I could confirm the first name. She settled in England, and I had several records from her where I could confirm that indeed the family name had been Chertok. Now, parenthetically, I think there's probably a good reason why they wanted to change their name, because if you look up the name Chertok in Russian, it means devil. So maybe that's a good reason why they wanted to change their name. But now at least I've got an opportunity to go back to the old country records, because if I looked for Wagner, I never would find them. That wasn't their name in the old country. So to conclude, I want to give you just a few slides just showing you things to consider when we're researching immigrants. Certainly, we've got multiple times and ways in which Jews took surnames that they then kept and passed on. Lots of different ways. You may find that there are many non-related people who acquired the same surname, and there are many related people who acquired different surnames. So that makes things really complex when we go back a few generations. One name studies, that's a really big thing among non-Jewish people. I actually have been somewhat successful with a very rare surname, but it's sometimes really complex and not doable because of all these changes as we go back in time. Now, rare surnames may help you identify origins, because you can look at books like the ones Alexander Beider has written, and these are all in your handout, or Lars Menk for Germany. And then, of course, Jewish Records Indexing has a really nice place where they'll put names on a map so you can see if they're localized in certain areas of Eastern Europe. That can be helpful. Genetic genealogy can be a challenge. Most of us have long lists of genetic matches with few to no surnames in common. That's very typical. And what we've talked about today is one of the reasons. there may be no correlation with relatedness, as we said, and one may find that there are fairly close matches with surnames that don't appear in your family tree at all. And they will take additional research to try to figure it out. Now, you can get transliteration and translation help from a number of different places. Certainly Facebook, there's several different places. There's Tracing the Tribe, Jewish Genealogy Portal. One of the ones that's really nice if you have kind of an more than just a matseva or something in Russian or another language, genealogical translations, you can upload images and get them translated from other languages. And of course, we don't want to forget ViewMate on Jewish Gen. One thing I want to tell you, and this is my own personal issue, I think it's really not a good thing if you have a long document to put that up and expect people to volunteer and translate it. If you have a long document, I would suggest that you save up some money and try to hire somebody, a professional, to translate it. That's only fair. Translation is a skill and should be rewarded, I think. So when you're looking for names, we talked about starting at home and working backwards, learning to learn your immigrants' names, and do that in the country to which they immigrated. Nailing down a surname, like I've shown you, when I was looking for Jackson, I couldn't find anything. I looked at his brother, I couldn't find anything. I wound up solving the problem by looking at not only his brother, but then going further and looking at his aunt and confirming what I found. So you may have to move out to what we call the fan club, friends, acquaintances, and neighbors or other family members. Look at those people. Don't just look at your one person and say, well, I've exhausted that, I can't find the answer. You may need to broaden out. Don't stop with one name. There may be several that could have been, or maybe one name in terms of your first name or your last name. There could have been more than one that were used by your immigrant. And practice. As I mentioned earlier, transcribing gravestone inscriptions can be really, really wonderful, particularly for understanding the variety of first names that you may find in both Hebrew and Yiddish, and the variety of names that they might have adopted in the new country, because there are no rules. It could be just about anything. So I apologize for going over. Oh, went over quite a bit. But I hope you have some questions. Thank you. And I will stop my sharing.
Oh, we have lots of questions. First of all, let's thank Emily. You're one of the first speakers I've ever heard who doesn't say or
Oh, well,
that's wonderful.
I'm glad I don't, it's been a work in progress.
Well, there are a number of comments and observations in chat. Barbara, do you want me to read those out loud?
Please.
Okay. I'm going to go from the last one up to the first one because Amy Harris, Amy, are you online? I can see that Amy is here. She writes that she has Garber ancestors and it's sometimes Gerber. They came from Switzerland in the mid 1700s. They were prominent in the Brethren Church. My fourth great grandmother, Mary Morningstar, also Morgenstern, married a Garber. The Morgensterns came from Bavaria around the same time. I've suspected that the Morgensterns are the source of my additional Ashkenazi DNA outside of my grandfather. Have you come across Garbers from Switzerland who were Jewish?
Garber is one of those classic names that can be just about anything. It can be Jewish, or there are many Garbers who are not Jewish. None of my Garbers are from Germany. All of my Garbers are from what is now Ukraine that I've found so far. And I didn't give this, my presentation was long enough, so I did not include this situation, but let me tell you that through family stories and through DNA and through genealogy research, I have confirmed that my great-grandfather, Avraham Abba Garber, had a brother, a full brother, who was named Levi Yitzhak Liederman. I don't know why, but they had two completely different last names. The story in the family is one of these four brothers stories, which could be apocryphal, that there was originally a name, the name was Uchenik, and there were brothers who were trying to avoid the draft. One became Garber, one became Lederman, one became Resnick, one kept Uchenik. I don't know if this is true, but I certainly do know that I have found this family that is closely related to me and can be attributed, and I actually have letters where Levi Yitzhak Lederman identifies his brother as Avraham Abba Garber and his nieces and his nephews. It's amazing. So I can, when people say to me, oh, are you related to this other Garber? I can actually say, probably not. I don't know what the original family name was, but it probably wasn't Garber in my case. I can't say that this is true for everybody, but strangely, I feel very fortunate in having been able to show that.
Amy does respond that she does have a lot of those names in her family tree. So Emily, if you don't mind, I will give Amy your email address and see what other commonalities there might be.
Absolutely. And my email address is on the handout as well.
Okay, wonderful. We have a question also from Robert. Robert, raise your hand, just wave a little bit there. Robert wants to know if you know the meaning or the significance of the given name of Schneier, and he's spelling it Schneir.
Oh, it's pronounced Schneier.
Or
Schneier.
Schneier.
I do not. It's not one that is very common, as I'm sure you know. What I would suggest is, excuse me, Alexander Beider has written a book on Jewish given names. And I believe I have probably put it in the handout as one of the sources. Or if you don't mind, I could even go get it. Hang on a second. I'll go grab it off the shelf.
And while Emily is doing that, we have a copy of it as well, Robert. So if she reads something to you of interest, I'll go upstairs where I'm hanging onto those books for us.
Oops. Okay, here we go.
Okay.
Here's the book. This is the book. It's by Alexander Beider, Dictionary of Ashkenazi Given Names. It's sold by Avotenu Publishing. It's a pricey book, but most libraries that have a good Jewish genealogy collection should have it. Does your JGS have a library like this?
We do have a lot of the Beider books. That one, I don't think we do have, but if you wouldn't mind taking a moment to see if Robert's family name is in there, that would be great.
It's a little hard to look. Whoa, excuse me. Let's see.
I have a Schneier-Velvel, a great-grandfather named Schneier-Velvel, and I thought it meant tailor. I thought it was an occupation.
Well, Schneider means tailor. It could very well in Yiddish. I am not a Yiddish speaker. Well, let's see.
Specifically, his name was I'm told, was Schneier Zalman, and he was too young to be a senior, if they use such terms.
Let's see. I'm up to Shmuel. Oh, here it is, Schneier. Okay. Commonly, let's see, romance. Okay. Let's see. Common noun meaning senior, elder, master. So there you go. But what you can do is what he does, of course, his is very empirically based. So he's got all this information based upon records that he's looked at. So that, if a place lost, if records from a particular location are lost, you're not going to see that in this book. But he can give you a variety, an area, a good idea of whether or not this occurs from the area that you're interested in. But yeah, so, and then he also gives variations on the name, which is cool too. But if you get to look at the book, it's on page 422. And there you go.
I'll check and see if we have it, Robert. On the internet, I did look it up, and it said that it is a German name. It is a habitational name for someone from a place called Schnee to the south of Coburg.
Well,
It
that
is
would be in
Ashken.
Germany. Yeah.
Mhm. And
That
then
doesn't-
from the Yiddish male personal name Schneier, which means senior.
Yeah, but Sinead, to be senior, you'd have to, I think, to be a junior. I mean, is there an
No,
equivalent?
or there
But
just could
now,
be
what-
other.
What, wasn't it an aspirational thing to name a child?
It could be, maybe they were hoping to have more children, or
Or
there
hoping this
were,
child
or it
would
could,
live longer than other
right. I
children?
mean, it could be, you just don't know. I mean, there are things you could think about. I mean, I guess what's the question about the name? It's a name. We know that. What is your concern about the name?
Well, I never see it appear anywhere. Just a name in. That's what I was told. Let me put it that way.
Well, it is a name. It's a real name. Biter, you can see it's codified in Biter. And it's an unusual name, but that's okay. You know, when I was growing up, there weren't very many Emilys, and I kind of like that. Now there's tons of them. You know, names come in and out of style too. And I would imagine, so in your family, do you have people been named after that person? And so you have several other ones with that name now?
No,
Oh, no one's name. Well, darn.
nothing.
My Schneier had a daughter named Elke, and we thought she had died in World War II, but she survived till 1980. And I have a picture of her monument, and it says Elke Schneierovna in the Russian patronymic style. And I had actually never seen his name in print or written in any fashion until I saw her monument. And it was one of those things where you look at it and you can't believe what you're seeing, because it made somebody real who I had no other documentation on.
And I will say, you know, having a relative or an ancestor with an unusual first name is great, because it should help you identify any of, you know, if that person is identified in an old world record as a father or as a grandfather, or you see that name repeated going back, you know, it can really help you make, you know, you can more easily make the assumption that that person's related to you, which is great. A lot of us, you know, my grandfather's name was Yaakov. I mean, that's a very common name. So if I find somebody, you know, whose father's name was Yaakov, I can't quite say that was them, but you have a greater chance of doing that with a name like Schneier in your family.
Except he never used that name in English in America.
But that doesn't make a difference,
Yeah.
because it would have been used, like I showed you today, in old world records and in very likely in other records associated with him in the Jewish community.
As possibly a manifest. That's
Right.
a thought, because I've never looked
Yes.
under Schneier. I looked under Zalman.
Well, yeah, he could have used either one.
Here
Oh,
you
okay.
go. You got a
You're-
lead,
You're
Robert.
giving me some things to chew about. Yes.
Good.
I think
Thank
a number of us are thinking about the homework we're going to do after Emily's program.
Yeah.
Emily, we have another question as well
Sure.
from Barbara. She wants to know if there's a relationship between the name Benjamin and the name Beryl for a man.
Well, you know, technically not. They're different names, but you do see that. And I've seen, you know, Benjamin Benjamin is a Hebrew name, and Dov and Ber is a Yiddish name. They don't necessarily go together, but I have seen instances where someone whose name was Ber in Yiddish came to the United States and decided to become Benjamin in English. I've seen that many times. Or, you know, in my father's case, he became Bernard. There were no rules. Nobody would say to them, I'm sorry, your name, you can't be Benjamin. They say, well, I like that name, you know. So there's no direct link in terms of those names, but it certainly is something reasonable that they could have adopted. And I've seen cases where people named Bear did adopt the name Benjamin.
My husband and I each have a grandfather who was known in this country as Benjamin, but it turns out they were both Barrels.
Mhm.
But I
Yeah.
think they picked Benjamin because it sounded American or it sounded
Right.
Canadian, you know.
Exactly. Yeah, they could be called Ben or Benny or whatever. Yes, absolutely.
Emily, is it possible at all that a woman would have a Yiddish name and no first I'll be specific. My mom's name was Fega. There are no records of her, even on her tombstone, having any other name except that Yiddish name.
Yeah. Yes. Typically, for girls, obviously didn't go through circumcision, so they didn't need a name 6 or 7 days after they were born. And they didn't get called, in the old days, they didn't get called to the Torah to read in synagogue. So they didn't need a Hebrew name for that. They might have had a Hebrew name, but they never used it. And no one, and it would be lost to subsequent generations. So, but there was no need for her to have a Hebrew name because she had no role in the synagogue. But she might have had one, but
Okay.
it may be lost.
I've got something. My mother was Helen, always was known as Helen. She passed away years later. I found her birth certificate and it said Sura or Sarah on it. So it was nobody ever called her that, but that was her birth name.
That's yeah, and you do see that a lot. A lot of times I'm looking for I do a lot of work in the New York City area where you can get older birth records, and a lot of times I find the names don't match up at all. You got to look for the parents' names on the records or look for the birth date, and even that sometimes changes. A lot of times people seemed like early on people would experiment a little bit. They might wind up being let's say their name, a typical one would be like a woman whose name was Scheindel. Maybe she became Jean, and later on she got fancier and she became Jeanette. You see things like that. People experiment with names, and they, and maybe who knows what their name was on their birth certificate. It might not match at all.
Yeah, my mother's parents and her 2 older sisters came from Russia, and my mother was the first child born here. So it could be that her parents were just adjusting to the American way of life, and they picked a Hebrew name to start with for the birth certificate.
Emily, I had mentioned to you an interest in nicknames. This was a real stumbling block for me. I wish I'd known you 10 years ago, because I didn't know that Srul was a derivative of Israel, but there were 2 others that just drove me crazy, and it took me forever. I saw the name Fuel, Fuel. It's a nickname for Raphael.
Oh, okay.
And the other one was Moniek,
Mm.
which apparently was Menachem.
Okay.
So,
sometimes you see Muna, or
okay. And
Right.
then the other thing that really messed me up for a while was Hungarians, when they make a nickname, they tend to add EKE to a name.
Mm.
And in Poland, or maybe it's Yiddish, ELE to a name. So my mother became Fegula. I'm
Yeah.
Debula.
Mhm. Mhm.
And in Hungarian, my dad's name was Tibor,
Mhm.
which then was shortened to Tibi. And
Mm.
to show fondness for my father, he was Tibica. And I
Okay.
kept thinking these are all different names. Who are these people?
Right.
So
Right.
it took me a long time, just like also the word endings in, I guess this is just like Russian, but in Polish, there's Dobrzyńska, Dobrzyński, Dobrzyńskowicz.
Yeah.
I kept thinking I'm looking at completely different families, not realizing they're all the same ones.
Right.
So those naming conventions, again, unless you have some guidance from Jewish Gen or somebody like you, and you're just starting out, it's extremely frustrating and confusing.
It is because we're, certainly in English, in our culture, we don't name people that way. But in these Slavic languages, they do. And they identify whether someone is a daughter or a son or a wife. And then the name changes, the ending of the name changes because of that. And yes, so you might find someone coming in, it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, particularly on passenger manifests, they might end, the last name might end in ska for a female. It's the same name, but they're just using the Cyrillic or the Slavic ending.
In that vein, what is the name Yechiel related?
That's a name.
Is that the full name?
Yeah, that's somebody. That's a name. Yeah.
Is there a nickname associated with it?
Oh.
And if one would, what would one translate that into English?
You could translate it as anything. I mean, it could be anything. Yechiel, it could be starting with an I, starting with a Y. I would suggest again that, Beider's name book is a good one to look at, because that will he gives you variations on the name that he's seen throughout Eastern Europe. So it'll give you a good idea of what would work.
Well, what letter would I look that up under?
I would look under that's one of the challenges, of course. I would start under Y, and then if you can't find it, use an I.
Or a J.
Or J. Yeah, exactly. But I would start, I guess I would start with Y, and then I, and then J. Yeah, look, see what you find. Because he will have variations. That's one of the challenges of a book form. It would be nice to see these things online. Of course, there is a Jewish Gen first name application that's hard to use. It was created a long time ago, but you can also throw names in that, and it will give you name variations in different languages.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I might be able to answer your question. This is a book that I have that's very helpful if you're really interested in the topic. And there is a name, Yechiel, apparently, that is a biblical name standing for the Lord lives. And it's also, in the Yiddish versions would be like Ichiel or Ichel. So it's...
Who's the author?
It's Shmuel Gore, Gorr. It's called Jewish Personal Names. So this is a little handbook that I find very helpful. That has a lot of information about the derivation of different names and the relationship between the Hebrew names and the Jewish names.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Could you put that in the chat for us, Herb?
You want me to write that into a chat? Okay.
Into the chat, yeah.
I've never done a chat, but I will give it a try.
Time to learn something new.
There you
click
go.
on.
Always, yeah.
There we go. And
Wait a minute. All right.
Michelle comments that her Yechiel was Mechel in Yiddish and became Michael in the US.
That's actually a different name, but
Yechiel, Mechel.
Yechiel and Mechel, I think, are two different names, I believe.
Yeah, I would think Michael and
But maybe that was maybe those are two of his names.
Okay. Herb, thank you for putting that into the chat. So Jewish personal names by Shmuel Gur. All right.
G-U-R-R?
G-U-R-R. Click.
I'm sorry. It's Gore, G-O-R-R. I mistyped it. Okay.
Okay. Robert, click on chat. Everybody needs to find the chat button because there's some good stuff in chat there. Okay, Barbara.
All right.
Did you want to add something, Barb? That's why I thought.
No.
Okay. I thought it might be helpful if you saw another resource for you, the Abu Tenu Consolidated Jewish Surname Index, and I'll put this in chat as well. And you can type in a name. Now, this is a surname. So, for example, I'll go ahead and type in Gallus, my mother's maiden name, and here are all of the different similar sounding names to Gallus. And you'll notice over here, on the right, databases. This is where the name shows up. So if you scroll down and you're looking for what's a P, it's a resource called the Dictionary of Sephardic Surnames, 2nd edition. So there's another resource for you. Emily, can you find on your computer the info files to show everybody? We can show those where everybody can find those as well.
I think they're on the handout though.
Oh, they're on the handout. Okay, very
yes,
good.
I believe so.
Okay, all right. Let me go ahead and put that Abutenu link. There you go. In the chat. Who else would like to ask a question? Those are all the ones I see in chat, but my guess is you might have some about your family names or names that you're interested in exploring with Emily.
Yeah, I have a question. I only learned a few years ago that my father's mother's name was Berkner, Berkner, and I had never before met any Jewish people who had that name until I met Roxanne when I came here. And it turns out that we may actually be related. It's a whole genetic link, and I think there's a lot of reason to believe that we probably are. And the only Berkners that I found in my research came from Krakow in the late 18th century. There was a very large Berkner family from Krakow that sort of spread out, and the Berkners that we may be related to were from Belarus, but I think they arrived there somewhat later on. So I'm just wondering if that name means anything to you or not.
Oh, it's not one that I've seen, but again, I would there are those Biter books where you can look up names in the Austrian Empire or in Poland or in Russia. And I would suggest that would be your first place to look. You can also, throw that name into the Abutenu thing that Debbie has just shown, and see what other resources there are for that. So I would suggest you look at that.
I'm going to see if I can. There was another resource that you mentioned on JRI Poland that I've used, and I'm going to see if I can dig that up while the rest of you are pondering questions that you might want to ask. Let's see. Okay, here we go. Let's see if I can share. I'll share my screen with you. And this is kind of fun if you've got Polish ancestry. I'm on the JRI website now, and there is a little place where you would normally type in somebody's name, but it's a mapper. And I'll go ahead and put in the name Gallus and hit map. Can you all see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, great. And it's going to show you all the places where the name Gallus shows up in, I believe, records that have been indexed by JRI. And the bigger the tree, the more Galluses there are in that area. And you can see also when I put my cursor over that tree, it says there are 110 matching records with the name Gallus. And so all I have to do is click on the Warsaw records, and here are all of the records with the Gallus last name. And I know some of these are my people. And some of them also have images over on the left. So you could, if the images have already been linked, to see, I think this is a birth record. Yes, this is a birth record.
Oh,
and
okay.
And there it is.
And the archive is back working. It wasn't working for a while, but I guess
it wasn't working for a big while, as my little girl used to say when she was little, a big while. It was just out of commission, which was very frustrating.
Yeah.
So that's a great, it's also interesting to see it clustered like that, isn't it, Emily? Because people moved.
That's why I say, particularly if you have an unusual name, if you've got a name like Cohen, forget it. Don't even try. I mean, it's going to be all over. But if a lot of times, if you have a name that's not very common, like the one you were just talking about, you might, it'll show you usually in a smaller area of Eastern Europe, and you can get an idea. The other thing to recognize, and we didn't really talk about this today, but people moved around a lot. And so even though you may think your people are from one community, when you start getting into the research in the old world, you'll find that families basically started to spread out over time, and that brothers and sisters, siblings moved to different communities, aunts and uncles are in different communities. But it is something that, you know, usually they didn't jump 300 miles. They might have gone to the next community that was 10 or 15 or 20 miles away. So those kind of maps are kind of cool because it can give you an idea, particularly with unusual names.
Could you also comment on what we might be able to do for records before the 1800s? I've heard that you sometimes should look in the Catholic registries.
Yeah, there are some situations, usually in more likely in the area that was Congress Poland. You will see, and actually I think Warren and Deborah Blatt have done a presentation on this as well, that some of these before Jews, let's put it this way, don't have a tradition of keeping their own records. They tended to start keeping these kind of vital records when they were forced to, similar to the taking names by different countries. But a number of Christian religions were different. And initially in Congress Poland, for some communities, if you start looking at their vital records kept by their church, sometimes at the end of the book, sometimes mixed in, you'll find some Jewish records. And I've actually done that kind of search for a community. I was looking through some records that were digitized by Family Search. And in this case, I did not find that, but I was talking to somebody who knew that community better than I. And I said to him, well, I've just gone through this. And he goes, oh, I'm so glad you did, because I've been meaning to do that. So definitely for some of these earlier records, particularly in Congress Poland, if there are some church records, go through, and usually what you're looking for again is not the last names, but the first names, that you can usually tell if they were Jewish first names, because we have a lot of these names that kind of repeating over and over. And so you look for the Jewish names and see if that, and then see what their parents' names were. Sometimes they might even be identified as a Jewish person. Now recognize the name, the records are going to be in Polish or in Russian or in Latin. So you have to get used to looking at those kind of things if you're going to start doing that. I don't know if any of those have been indexed or not. So it's the kind of thing that you might have to do yourself for a community.
Okay.
I'm
I've got so
ast-
much work to do.
I'm astounded at the detail that you find in these records. Like when you were showing us the illegitimate children who were later legitimized by their parents getting married in their 40s and 50s. I mean, I'm just amazed that records were kept like that. What happened in Belarus? There's not much. And were the records destroyed or were they not kept? Do you know?
Well, okay, first of all, the record that I showed you, or the records that I showed you, were records that I pulled down from Jewish Records Indexing Poland. Right. So those are records from the Austrian Empire, which as a result of Napoleon coming through and then later codifying that he wanted people to keep records, and then even after they threw him off, they started keeping records, that they have more of a tradition of doing this. There are a lot of records in the Russian Empire. What you're talking about in Belarus is Russian Empire. We're finding more and more records. Belarus is one of those places that's, unfortunately, because of their government, a little bit of a black hole, although there are people going into their archive and finding things. So the best bet for those countries usually are revision lists, which are their equivalent. They're not quite census records, but close. And that would be the thing to look for first, to see if you can find any. These revision lists show basically family groups, and they link from one previous revision, which might have been 15 or 20 years before, to the next one. That would be your best bet. There are places that do have some vital records, but it's real spotty. But there's more out there than we know about. We've got one of the things I think is very telling is that if you're familiar with what's going on with Alex Krakovsky in the records of Ukraine, that his being able to go into the archives has really created an incredible resource that we just didn't have before. We knew where some of the records were because Miriam Weiner had identified those through her inventory, but we couldn't get a hold of them. Well, now we can. With the current government of Belarus, that's unlikely to happen, but I don't think we should think that the stuff is not there. Probably the answer there is to be contacting a researcher who can go into the archives and see if there's anything for your community.
I've actually got somebody in Belarus working on it, but obviously it's a pretty bad time right now too.
Oh, let me know if it works, I have some people in Belarus too, and I have not gone through I'm not quite ready with names and places to start paying somebody to do that, but that's my hope ultimately, because it's a funny situation. It's the grandparent that I knew the best and about whose family I know the least.
Which is weird. You want to ask them questions like, right now I have a list of questions for my grandma.
Okay, do we have any other questions for Emily? Because she's been so generous with her time. I know you feel you ran over, Emily, but it's actually, from my perspective, we're taking advantage of you.
That's quite all right. I do need to go before 1:15, but beyond that, I'm good. Or
All right.
well, 1:15 my time. I don't know what time it is in your 3:15.
Almost 3:15.
Almost 3:15.
Okay.
Well, I don't see any other questions, but again, everyone is welcome to stick around for any chit chat or some, perhaps you hit a brick wall, but this would be a great time if your brick wall is on a name to ask Emily. Em, it looks like you're excused.
Thank you so much, Emily. So much.
Thank you so much.
Great
That was
information.
great. I learned so much. I'm very appreciative.
And as I said, my email address is on the handout. And by all means, if you have a question, ask me. I don't know if I'll be able to answer, but I certainly will try to point you in the right direction.
Thank you.
Thank you. Be well.
Thank you.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Okay.
All right, folks, before we start talking about brick walls, don't forget to pay your dues.
They're a modest $27,
Yes,
really.
yes. There's hardly
I thought-
anything you can join for $27 anymore.
I thought Emily was great. As I start to get into these outer branches, I don't have that many more things that I think are of interest for me to explore. And then I hear somebody like Emily and I realize, wait a minute, there's a detail or two here that I've overlooked. She was very articulate, wasn't she?
Yes.
Very
Yes.
organized.
Very
Yes.
good.
Okay. Who would like to share a question that you're working on, or perhaps a revelation that you've discovered? Ed, good to see you. I know you're busy with your book. That's wonderful. Mike, you working on anything interesting other than traveling to far and exotic places? You're muted.
Can you hear me now?
We can.
No, actually, I'm just about to get back into genealogy and catch up on all the people who've been born in my family. Have to add them to the tree. And I just had a 20-year-old cousin who I've never met email me, and she wants to talk about the family and genealogy. So hopefully I can pass stuff on to her and then I can retire.
I don't think you'll ever retire, Mike. I'm in kind of a similar situation. I'm not, I don't have anything quite of interest yet in my family tree to explore, but people are coming to me with their questions. One of them is a girlfriend whose father was murdered, and she thinks it's an unsolved murder, but she has a new theory. And she wanted me to help her with access to some of the databases I have to find out if her theory is correct. And of course, a lot of what we do, is based on, or what we find would be based on databases. So her theory involves next door neighbors who might have had something to do with this crime. And we're talking about her going to the Toledo Public Records, to the police department, speaking to retired police, to journalists. So that's kind of fun too. And it's kind of a related thing for me. That's what I'm going to be working on for a little bit. Anybody else?
Finally broke down and took a subscription to newspapers.com. I was holding it for, and the whole world of genealogy reopened to me. It's amazing.
Yeah.
What I'm able to uncover. And as a result, I kind of fill in a couple of blanks. What I've been working on is other people's trees. They've come to me and said, I know nothing about my family. And I sit down and with my tools in hand, I get a tree of 200 people in about a week.
Yeah.
And they go, you're crazy, you're amazing. And I've done that for 2 people that I know. And she said, I didn't know that my parents were born. My great-grandparents came from Greece. They were Ashkenazi Jews. Her DNA said she was Ashkenazi 100%. And yet her great-grandparents came from Greece.
There's
A couple of generations, that there's got to be some residual if you're Sephardic or Mizrahi or something else. Okay. And, but apparently they're came from Ashkenazi world. So, never know.
Yep.
Call me on my phone, but
Okay.
I put that
All
myself.
right. Anyone else have a story to share, research question? Because otherwise I think we're ready to call it.
So I guess I gave my little story at 12:30. I don't know if I should repeat it or not, about Norma's cousins.
Well, I think the methodology is always interesting. How you connected
Yeah.
Norma with these second cousins.
Yeah.
So just a quick thumbnail sketch here.
Norma's father was one of 8 cousins, but her father really didn't know the cousins except for one who lived in Florida. And she got up with me this week and told me that another cousin has a daughter who is interested in genealogy. And the daughter called me. The daughter is almost 50 years old. And she had started a family tree, which she shared with me. And I was able to super confirm her identity because at our wedding 63 years ago, this girl's great-grandparents were at our wedding, and we had a picture of them at our wedding, at one of the wedding tables. So we know that she's really a blood relative of Norma's. So we'll be adding a lot more cousins to our tree.
Well, and the incredible thing is the pictures. I mean, a lot of people have pictures. You can see them on Facebook. They post these pictures. They don't know who anybody is in the pictures, or can you identify the hall or whatever. And you actually have the picture and you know who these folks are. And when the cousin came to you, like, it must have been such a revelation that here was the picture sitting in your house.
We weren't sure because, I mean, Gerson or Herson, we knew the G and the H are interchangeable. There are a lot of Gersons and a lot of Hersons. And I at first thought was that thinks she's cousins, but she probably isn't. But it turns out that she really is. And so she's thrilled with the connection. And so are we.
Amazing.
And I invited her to come to the meeting today, but she was taking her daughter shopping, so she'll probably show up at our next meeting. And I'll let Debbie know who it is, so when she logs on, you'll recognize the name and let her into
Okay.
as a
And
guest.
I'm sure you'll introduce her too for us.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll know her a lot better in 2 months than I do right now.
All right.
It's only been 2
Well,
days.
And the next time we meet will be in April, as Barbara said, and we will have somebody who's going to tell us all about JRI Poland, which is a website I've used for years, and it's undergone a major facelift. And there are a lot more records now available. So if you have Polish, Ukrainian, Russian, even German roots, you might find that this website is very, very helpful to you.
Yeah,
Well,
and
folks,
Norma's family is from Poland, so it'll be.
okay. There you go. I think
Uh,
I'm gonna have to take the lead and sign us off because we are
Debbie?
past our 3:15
Debbie?
time. Yes.
Oh, I just want to say that David is helping me with what Barbara started in her genealogy search. And David is helping me complete it to whatever extent we get to.
Yeah,
And
he told us about that, Jordan, at right before the meeting started. He said he's already added a number of names and starting to get things organized. I know Barbara would be so pleased.
yes, she would.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Be well, stay well until we see you the next time and even beyond. Take care, everybody.
Fine.